Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. On the show today is Suzanne Bauer. So Suzanne has joining us in the Bay Area. She's known for her work with embodiment and teens. So I guess that's going to be quite one of the main subjects. Founder of Embodiment Education. She's done some stuff in Indonesia we're going to talk about. On the board for his Meta. Bainbridge Cohen student, Authentic Movement student. So plenty of things going on. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark. So good to talk to you.
So Susan, what was the beginning of your journey with the body?
Well, I was born, first of all, which is quite a miracle. You know, we use this word embodiment, but it really, we are embodied. It's just how do we live our lives? And then how does our embodiment evolve in our lifetime, right? So I grew up in New Jersey and I started dancing as a young teen, kind of traditional, ballet, jazz, and tap kind of things. But I also lived near New York, so I went in and studied with some really fabulous teachers, the well-known teachers of the time, Luigi and Jazz and different people. So I had a real desire to be moving and active as a young child. I also noticed in school I got really interested in biology, and I took like the advanced biology class, and we dissected a cat, as they often do. And at the same time, I was taking an art class. And I was thinking about this morning. I did this painting that I still have of Peter Martins and Suzanne Farrell, who are famous ballet dancers, in this pose, beautiful pose on stage. But the strange thing was I actually painted them with the very detailed musculature, all the different muscle groups. So if you looked at the painting up close, it looked like I, had the dancers on stage, but had taken off the layer of their skin. But if you looked at it from far away, it looked like a normal painting because it just made the correct shading. So I guess I was very interested in our bodies and the anatomy of our bodies. I also had some feet injuries as a child. So my first probably 16 years of my life, I had about 4 different operations. And then I would watch my body heal and be quite amazed at what the body could do and how it would look one way, and then a few months later it would look another way. So I think that was part of it. And then when I got to college, I went to Middlebury College, and I took my first course in what was called Experiential Anatomy with Karen McCose. I don't know if you're familiar with her. And there it was like a whole different world of movement. Instead of learning external poses and shapes and getting my leg up high and, this dance world, it was this, when I watched her move, it was like she was a leopard, on the mountains, or she was a fish in the water. There was something so relaxed and organic and aware in her body. And I wanted that. And I almost felt like, hey, what happened? Like that kind of got trained out of me. I was a very accomplished dancer, but I didn't necessarily have this ease of movement that I felt in her body. So I really loved this experiential anatomy course. We learned all about the anatomy and colored anatomy plates. We also did journal writing, so it got really personal, like about our own body story. And I wrote about my feet and my operations, and actually my feet started getting better because I started doing some hands-on, body work that I learned through that course with my feet and legs. So that was a real turning point for me. And then I moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, which is where Bainbridge Cohen has a school for body-mind centering. And Janet Adler's school for authentic movement was in that area too. So I kind of stumbled into this rich world of embodiment that was going on at the time. I'm going to take a breath here. Okay.
So it's two very well-known teachers. You literally just accidentally ended up there?
Yeah, I did. And it's funny. When before I moved there, the reason I moved there is I had toured with the Middlebury Dance Company, and we performed there in Northampton. And I remember feeling actually really awkward. I don't know if you know Judith Jameson from Alvin Ailey, but she had come set a piece on us. And, we were supposed to feel great about all this famous dance we were doing. And I remember feeling on stage like I was wearing someone else's clothes. Mm-hmm. And each dance I was putting on someone else's clothes, but where were my clothes? So when I moved to Northampton, I liked the area, so I moved there. But I remember calling up my teacher, Andrea Olson, who was my dance teacher at Middlebury, and saying, I don't know what to do. I'm in Northampton. I want to keep moving, but I don't want to take technique classes. And there's this thing called contact improvisation where like people are rolling all over each other and throwing each other in the air. And I found that. And then there's this thing called authentic movement where they're closing their eyes and like moving. And I don't know what to do. And she said, oh, Susan, that's very simple. If you want to connect with the dance community in Northampton, you should take the contact improv class. And if you'd like to connect with yourself, you can take the authentic movement class. So I took that authentic movement class. And that was the beginning of, that was 1984, I guess, 85. That was the beginning of my very long time, still to this day, journey with doing authentic movement and teaching it. But I found through that I was getting in touch with a really more organic way of moving that I was yearning for. And at that same time is when I found Bonnie Cohen's work, and Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, started studying with her at the School for Body-Mind Centering. And I remember my first class with Bonnie, actually, I was coming straight out of college where you have a syllabus and a structure to follow. And I took this class with Bonnie, and I don't remember the details, but, we're going to study the way the pinky relates to the scapula and move the arm. And halfway through, we're on the liver related to the spleen or something. And I was going, what's happening here? So I actually went away from that. I didn't work with Bonnie for about 3 months after that first class. But I noticed that something had really changed over those 3 months. I kept having these new awarenesses and awakenings in my body. And that was it. I just thought I have to go back and figure out what she's doing and what happened. So
Great.
That was.
So just for listeners, they may not be so aware of experiential anatomy type work. So you want to sort of take a step back here and say, for people who are complete beginners in the area, what is that?
Yeah, so experiential anatomy is a way of embodying and learning about our anatomy, but not just cognitively. Mm-hmm. So we're moving and using touch, self-touch, or maybe touch with a partner, in coordination and combination with the actual, anatomy study, so a more cognitive study. And there might be some drawing, some personal expression, like journal writing about your body as well. So it's a much more personalized, we talk about somatic approach. Soma meaning the body lived from within, right? Our subjective personal experience. So the experiential anatomy approach is based in your personal experience of discovery of your body through a cellular awareness, not just a cognitive learning. That makes sense.
Yeah, I don't like that phrase, cellular awareness. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think cells, you can be aware of cells. I mean, you've got nervous system awareness, but it just seems a slightly odd phrase to me. I hear people use in that world, like cellular awareness. Is the implication you can feel a cell?
Yeah, the implication is that, different organs and different systems are made up of cells. So the nervous system is just one type of cell. And that's the cells that register and bring information to the brain. But other cells are also aware. Our body has a essential awareness. It's just we don't become aware of the awareness until it's registered in our nervous system. But it doesn't mean there isn't an awareness. And I'm probably not, the best person to go into all the physiology about it, but that's my best way of kind of explaining that, if that makes some sense for you.
Some sense, probably not enough sense yet, but I'll hold it as agnostic for now. In terms of why do anatomy experientially, it's a better way of doing anatomy? Is it that it leads to other benefits? I meet some people that are really obsessed with sort of spending 8 days in a row feeling into their spleen or something. And part of me just really wonders why.
Well, I would love to answer that. And then I'm going to get back to my journey at some point. Because
Yes.
Yeah. So what I'd love to do, if I can pause a moment, is answer that with one of my students' own journal entries. And so what this is an exercise that we do to understand the relationship of the heart and the lungs. So you have your heart in your rib cage and then 2 lungs on the left and 3 on the right. And they kind of hug the heart, right? So we do this exercise where you put a fist out, let's say one person, and the other person puts their two hands around their fist. And this is what this one girl wrote about that activity. A lasting thought for me was the image of one's hands cupped around another's closed fist. It reflects the very image of the heart encased by the lungs. Just as how the lungs shield the heart, so does the sternum and ribs protect the lungs. Thinking about this just made me feel safe in my own body. So if you think of like an 18-year-old or 16-year-old, I forget how old she was exactly, writing that, much more personal connection to your body where you develop an authentic kind of caring and compassion for yourself.
That's quite lovely, that, isn't it? And there can be these anatomical understandings. It's when experienced reshape one's relationship to body, or in this case, actually the wider world.
Yes. And this is another woman, a girl who wrote this. I started out feeling very self-conscious in this class. I think I was afraid of my body, but being aware of what's in my body and how I move makes me more at ease. Having knowledge about my body allows me to feel a bit more confident. So those are the kind of emotional benefits, and then there's practical benefits. There's this term I feel is so relevant in our culture is override. We're often really not paying attention to our bodies and overriding, leading personally to stress in our body, to tension, and collectively to a myriad of health problems and obesity and chiropractic needs. And, our culture really is a mess from not knowing how to take care of ourselves. So I think there's also a really deep need for more self-awareness and self-empowerment to care for ourselves and our bodies.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And maybe you could say a little bit about authentic movement, because again, it's widely known in some circles, but not in others. So you're at the root of it with Janet Adler, right?
Yeah. So actually at the root of it is Mary Whitehouse, who began exploring this process of having people move with their eyes closed. And she would sit to the side and observe with eyes open. And then they would have a discussion or some creative way of processing whatever emerged in the mover's movement, whether it was through clay or drawing or speaking. So Janet Adler was one of the people who studied with Mary. And then when Mary Whitehouse died, she started what was called the Mary Whitehouse School, I think it was called Institute for Authentic Movement in Northampton, to explore this relationship of the mover and the witness. Mary's work was also in Jungian psychology when those ideas were prevalent about the unconscious and the conscious mind, and people kind of use that language. And Mary felt that through moving with your eyes closed and just following your natural impulses for movement, you got more in touch with that more unconscious place in yourself that got expressed through your movement, almost like a dialogue then between your unconscious and your conscious mind. So maybe in the way that you would analyze a dream, or you would look at what's the meaning, it became another access point to kind of maybe a deeper point of knowing that was below our conscious mind through our movement.
Okay, so where does this get to in your journey?
Okay. So yes, I was doing authentic movement and studying body-mind centering. And then I went back to graduate school at Wesleyan University, which was great. It was a summer program, so I could live in Northampton, but travel down to Connecticut in the summers for this program. And there I started studying dance anthropology with Cynthia Novak, dance therapy. This program was very rich. It had a wide range, ideokinesis with Irene Dowd, and dance improvisation. So there I started really getting more of what I call an anthropological lens of seeing movement as cultural expression, and these ways that I'd grown up kind of believing that, this is what a feminine ballet dancer looks like, or this is what the male role is, or all of these things were particular to my culture, and started really seeing with a broader lens what I'd kind of taken on more unconsciously as fact, when in fact other cultures see it differently, kind of wake point. And then at some point I saw a film about Bali. This is how much we want to get into this now or later, but I ended up getting really interested in Bali, starting traveling to Bali, and that led me going to UCLA, which had a Balinese gamelan and more of a connection to Bali. So after Wesleyan, I did my MFA at UCLA, where I also taught experiential anatomy there, but I was a student as well, and starting to choreograph with these masks that I made in Bali, doing dance theater performances, kind of bridging my Western dance background with this new Balinese work.
Okay, and I think we should probably get into the work with teens. Kind of what led you to focus on that group?
Yeah, so when I lived in Northampton, I started my first kind of full-time dance job. I was working at a private high school. And so since I'd done that work with Karen McCose and my new work with Bonnie, I thought, wow, this is so important. I should try it and do this with teens. So I started a class. Actually, they wouldn't let me call it Experiential Anatomy. They thought that was too provocative. So we called it Kinesthetics or something. But I started teaching a class there, and I found two things. I found that the students really were interested and wanted to learn about their bodies and feel more comfortable in themselves. And I also found that these somatic practices I'd learned were not immediately transferable to these teens.
Right.
That the approaches had really been developed in a sense. I feel the whole field of somatics was developed for a generation, many generations of adults that never had, that were suffering from this body-mind split and never really had this other kind of, had gotten disconnected from this body wisdom that we really have. So in a sense, somatics was developed to heal this generation of adults, but it was developed for adults. So for instance, a lot of the approaches were way too improvisational for these teens. They needed a little more structure. So anyway, I took about 12 years actually developing an approach to somatic education that would really meet these teens where they were and let them feel that this was for them, not at them. A lot of education is just putting things on top of people and kind of forcing this learning. This was more, had to make them feel that this was about them and that they had agency and that it was important to them. Mm-hmm. So it took about 12 years of teaching with teens and middle school and high school, developing these approaches. And then at Wesleyan, I did my MA thesis about the curriculum. That's when I essentially wrote it as a curriculum, and that became my thesis. That now has turned in, eventually over the next 20 years of developing that more in the U.S. and in teaching in Asia. I formed that into this book.
Nice. It's interesting, actually. I've worked quite a lot with children and a little bit with teens. And the idea that you can just kind of translate things across directly from adult world, I found to be not the case. And the same cross-culturally, to go back to your earlier point about culture, is that you can't teach embodiment the same in different cultures either. It seems with any population, there needs to be some kind of adaptation.
Right. And that's how I came up with that sort of system of the 8 pedagogy principles of, if you have these 8 things in place, whether you're coming from my background, which is more experiential anatomy, or whether you're coming from Feldenkrais or Alexander or a different somatic practice, if you have these things in place, it's likely going to work with teens. And if you're missing any one of them, you're likely going to be in trouble.
Do you want to hit us with a couple of these then, these principles?
Oh, sure. And some of them are, obviously when you hear them are more applicable to generally teaching somatics, but some of them are more specific to teens. So the first one is, of course, balancing objective and subjective experience. That we really learn, information can be learned, but knowledge comes from your own lived experience. So to have this more somatic approach, you have to include the subjective experience and make room for people to learn in that way. So for instance, the journal writing that I just read you about your own experience of the activities has to be part of it, as well as the actual fact, objective learning about your body. The other one that's really important with teens is I call student-driven curriculum. And what that means is that you start with what the students already know, and then you build on that. So for instance, if we're studying about breathing, I'm not going to come in and say, okay, we're studying about breathing and here's about the lungs and the diaphragm. And instead, they move around and we do different activities where they feel the changes in their breath, whether they're moving slow or fast. Then they're lying down. Maybe put your hands, one on your chest, one on your belly. Feel what happens when you breathe. And then there's two components they do next. One is that they get in groups and talk about, well, what do I know about breathing? And they kind of brainstorm, and someone will write lungs and diaphragm and, cells and oxygen, whatever they know. And then we come back and pool what they know. And then I would be able to add other information based on what their questions are, right? Which is a really different approach. The other thing is that I give them a journal entry. That's one of their favorite things we end up doing, which is a free response writing. So there's two prompts. The first one is, I can breathe when, and the second one is, I can't breathe when.
Nice. Like really simple link to somatics.
Yeah, really linked to how is your body mind being affected by your internal and external environment, right? And to really get that that's a thing that we have to look at as we get our, in adolescence, we often get the skills we take into adulthood. So to really understand that interconnection at that age is really powerful. I'd love to read you one entry from a student. I can't breathe when I'm nervous. I can't breathe when I'm crying. I can't breathe when I'm overthinking things. I can't breathe when I watch something scary. I can't breathe when I try too hard. And then I can breathe when I feel comfortable. I can breathe when I'm outside and under the sun. I can breathe when I dance. I can breathe when I'm moving. I can breathe when I'm confident. I can breathe when I'm with my friends.
Nice. Very nice. I love the simplicity of that, because it just takes people straight to what they already know, right? Like without using complicated terminology. And, I can well imagine a teen or even a child actually saying something along those lines, and actually having enough self-awareness to realize a lot of that already.
Yeah, and then the other beautiful part is they get to share that in community. We, especially in those teen years, we're really bonding with wanting to belong. And so where's our community? What are we going to belong to? Well, when you get to start talking about these kind of things together, it brings out, in a sense, your vulnerability and also your strength, and gives more of a, builds community really by sharing at this deeper level.
Nice. And what are some of the misconceptions then? Because this is something you mailed me about. That sometimes this kind of misconceptions amongst teen groups.
Yes. So, and actually it's the same I find when I work with adults in my teacher training too. But so one of the activities we do early on is we start with learning, in terms of where we're going to start in the body. We often start with the skeleton because it's quite concrete. You can feel your bones. And they'll draw the skeleton. And often one of the first things that I notice, and they'll draw the spine from the side, I have them do as well, is they'll draw a straight spine. So like it's a pole. And, where do we get that perception? Well, language has an impact. And we say, sit up straight and straighten up, right? And so we get this image of our spine as this straight pole. And I'd say, 60 to 70% of the students and adults will draw that. So then we take some time to learn about the curves of the spine. So we'll sit in partners, and with a flat hand, you can just kind of feel along the back, and you can feel that the spine is curved. And then we'll learn about the different vertebrae, the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar, and sacrum. And then they'll get to feel the relationship of these three body weights of the skull, torso, and pelvis that the spine is balancing, and feel that that's a dynamic relationship. It's not a static thing like a line. So it both reveals the misperceptions, and then we have a way to address that to start to, in a sense, align our inner perception with the reality of our bodies rather than some outside factor, because it really has an impact. I had one girl who would come in. She had a ballet teacher. Not all ballet teachers are this way, but she had taught her to, keep the pole in line, she told her. So she'd come in with like her chin tucked in and down, and her, no curve in the cervical spine. And she could barely turn her head. She would be so sore. So like to talk to you, she'd have to turn her whole body. So as she started learning about this, she really got a more relaxed sense in her spine that let some of that tension go.
Yeah, the misperceptions can be quite odd, actually, once you've learned they're not true. Like, if you ask people to draw what part of the foot touches the ground, most people would draw a sort of foot shape, but it's actually a kind of weird kidney bean. It's to kind of one side of it, and and that's quite obvious. If you've ever walked on sand, you've seen those footprints. They're not foot shaped. There's a side to the foot that touches and a side that doesn't. And that's, some of them where joints move from. I mean, you think these things are obvious, but they're really not, particularly if people have a mental image in their head that they've somehow got, that the spine's this way, or the legs start here, or the arms start there, or whatever.
Right. And what a beautiful way that would be to teach about the arches of the foot, is to take kids to the beach and walk and look at your footprint, right? Let's make this real. That's kind of the point. The other one they often misperceive, and you probably find this in your work with adults too, is that when you breathe, that your abdomen should move in, like the six-pack abs.
Yeah.
And we take a lot of time unpacking that one, of how actually the diaphragm that separates the abdominal and thoracic cavity needs to descend. And when it descends, those organs have to go somewhere. So they're going to come forward a little bit. And the belly and the chest need to expand. So there's a lot of, that term repatterning gets used a lot. This kind of thing is a lot of repatterning of both how we imagine our bodies and how we're actually, breathing and living in our bodies.
Quick interruption to tell you about my book, Embodiment. Creatively named, hey? Actually, Embodiment Moving Beyond Mindfulness. You can find this online at theembodimentbook.com. That's theembodimentbook.com. So this book is an introduction to the whole field. If you like these interviews, you'll probably love this book. Funny stuff, poems, personal stories from my life, illustrating what embodiment's all about, and loads for professionals in the field too. Top teaching tips, language tips, that kind of thing. Yeah, a real condensation of everything I've learned about embodiment, basically. So you can get pre-orders at Amazon.com, and if you just put in Embodiment Moving Beyond Mindfulness, that's the name of the book, or go to theembodimentbook.com. On there, you'll see quotes from various teachers, a bunch of fun illustrations, and you can also get the first chapter completely free online at theembodimentbook.com. Enjoy, and back to the interview. I mean, maybe let's go back to the principles. So I was enjoying those, and so teaching.
I'd love to do that. Another important one is to balance sensory and motor experience. And this is really important because a lot of somatic practices, as you're aware, focus quite heavily on what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. Really sensing inside and slowing down, and maybe even lying down and moving in gentle ways.
Yeah.
And that's great. But in any one system, when we go too long and too far in any one system, we become, overwhelmed in that system. So if you go too much into that, you get lethargic and groggy, right? Our culture tends to have the opposite problem. We're so in the sympathetic nervous system, go, 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 that we get exhausted from being too outward, right? So you would think that, let's just have all kids lie down. Come on in and lie down. Well, that really doesn't work, because if you picture like a train going, really fast, and then you try and stop it too fast, it kind of burns out the wheels, right? So my experience has been that you really have to balance this. So we often start, moving around the room or jumping, or we do this game where we pretend we're playing basketball, and then we do it in slow motion, and, just some fun things to get moving and express.
Yeah.
And then you can kind of, all right, now stand and feel your body scan, and now roll down your spine, and now come down to lying on the floor. And then they love to lie on the floor.
This is interesting, because what you're pointing to, actually, I think is a prejudice across the somatic world, that parasympathetic is better, slow is better, relaxed is better, being on the floor is better. And I understand how that's developed as a sort of medicine for our, very yang sympathetic culture, that most people do need that. But I think the first thing to say is, not everyone needs that. Like a depressed person doesn't need that.
Exactly.
And some people may need to do more of the energetic side first. And even that predisposes, the point is the soft side. I also wonder if this is why there's far more women in somatics across the world. There's this sort of prejudice and emphasis on the sort of soft, slow, soothing movement. And that's not what I want to do a lot of the time, even if it's good for me sometimes.
Yeah, Mark, this is so important that we're talking about this. In my experience, I don't have background in all somatic practices, of course. I've studied, Feldenkrais, ideokinesis, body-mind centering, Laban, or Taniev. But I find in the body-mind centering model is the clearest example of actually balancing this, because that model is exploring all the different body systems. So if you're exploring, for instance, the blood and the arterial flow of the blood, that's the pump, that's the clap, right? And it has that active motivating force behind it. So really, and I emphasize this in the curriculum, it's not just about slowing down and quieting down. In a way, this mindfulness approach, sometimes it can be perceived as repressive because it's just sit still and be quiet. It's actually about how can we express all aspects of ourselves in balance. So it's really trying to find a balance. So in my curriculum, I'm not just emphasizing that quiet side. We're actually also learning, we do another activity where we feel with a partner or yourself, the different qualities of moving from different systems. So like if you wiggle your wrists around, floppy-like, that's kind of getting in your synovial fluid, and then if you put that in your whole body and start jiggling, Bonnie often calls that the jovial synovial fluid. Pretty soon everyone's laughing because it's like, well, it's funny to do that. So how can you express in all of the systems, not just the parasympathetic?
Yeah, and as you say, sometimes you have to go one place to get the other. I used to teach kids. I used to do a game called Start Stop, very simple game where the kids would be allowed to go completely crazy, run around and scream. There's an Aikido mat, so it was quite soft and safe. And they'd go utterly berserk, and they'd love it because they never get to do that, right? And then I'd say, a signal, I'd put my hand up, and they'd all stop, and then we'd do belly breathing or some kind of centering. And they were quite happy to do the stopping after doing the running around. They just found it as a challenge, And if you just tried to teach them the sort of centering and stuff straight out the bag, then you would have got that resistance because they wanted to run around.
Exactly. And that's why we need to honor movement. We need to honor that we want all, it's like saying, okay, you're going to have breakfast, you're going to have granola for breakfast every day. Well, that's really boring. So it's the same with movement. We crave, variety and difference and expression. So a somatic approach, I feel a true healthy somatic approach is going to encourage all of those aspects. I think you're right that we've prioritized the parasympathetic because it's so missing in our culture now.
Granola every day. It's the perfect analogy for the overabundance of Californian teachers in embodiment. I've found the perfect metaphor. We don't have granola, by the way, in the UK, Susan. It doesn't exist. It's an equivalent. But
can I tell you one more?
One more. Then I want to talk more about teens.
Okay. So another one that's really important is to teach about proprioception and interoception. So, that's the way that we learn movement. And we're not really taught how do we learn movement. So our proprioceptors are the nerve receptors in our joints that tell us where we are in space, our position in space. And our interoceptors are more the internal organs that tell us things like if I'm breathing heavily or shallowly, or if I'm hungry, or that kind of thing. So, when you're learning somatic approaches or doing this experiential anatomy, it can be kind of disorienting at first, because in order to learn a new pattern, you're first having to unlearn another pattern. So part of what I'm purposefully setting up is activities that are going to disorient the person's nervous system. But that's kind of, then they say things like, oh, this class is weird. Well, what does weird mean? It means I've never experienced this. So you have to give a framework for why are you feeling a little uncomfortable and weird, and make space for them to go through that by explaining it in relationship to proprioception and this process of reorienting to new, healthier patterns in your body. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Appreciate that. Teens kind of get a bad rep, don't they? And my experience of working with teens has been largely pretty positive. I've definitely met the mopey, angsty, it's so unfair, no one understands me but Limp Bizkit kind of type. But I've also met like a lot of really good teens that I found were pleasure to work with, got as long as you motivated them through what they were interested in and treated them with respect. Why do you think teens have sort of such a bad rep? Like, there's a British comedy and there's a child and the child becomes a teenager and it's like, oh my God, he's a teenager now. Can you speak a little bit to that?
I can only speak from my experience teaching teens. I'll just right up front say I'm not a parent, so I'm sure a parent of a teen would have a lot more to say about it than I do. But I think part of it is that it's the natural age to kind of rebel and, bond more with your peers than with adults. And when adults can't control a child, they get freaked out. So I think it's sort of the adult perspective of, oh no, teens, because we don't know what to do with them anymore because they want to do their own thing. And I don't know that there's a lot of understanding in education about how to, well, I shouldn't say that. I think we're doing a lot better actually, but how to become an ally for teens so they feel actually supported. Well, one of the things I find with teens, they often really feel like their voice doesn't matter. There's so much decided for them. There's so much, measurements to meet, which is good. It's motivating to have to meet measurements, but feel disempowered, and how to really meet them where they are and help them develop from within, I think would help remedy this stereotype, because then you would really see who they are rather than who we're trying to make them be, Yeah,
definitely see that pushback that happens in teen years and a sort of questioning of things. And there's a sort of teen posture, which is, again, a stereotype, I think based on something like I see particularly a lot of teen girls kind of collapse in at the chest, and teen boys kind of have that sort of slightly lethargic sort of almost hopeless posture, the dangly arms, and there's some biological reasons for this as well, like teenagers needing more sleep and things like that, right? But maybe you could speak to some of that classic teen somatics.
Yeah, well, what I can speak to is, yes, this issue of posture. I actually have a part of the curriculum that I have in my book relates to posture. And it's both to get more of awareness of how that your internal world affects your posture, which I think is the kind of thing you're naming, with maybe collapsing, wanting to disappear a little, or maybe you're developing and you're, hiding, whatever the issue, or with boys. But what we look at in the curriculum is also the cultural impact and how that affects your posture. So there's two activities we do. The first one is always like really funny for adults and kids to do, is if you can imagine, kind of standing and aligning your three body weights, which we would have talked about in the curriculum already. And then they take each one of them and shift them slightly. So for instance, you'd shift your head a little forward of your center and then notice what that does to your shoulders and chest. And then you walk around like that. And then you look at each other and talk and, kind of hold that posture. Even though posture is dynamic, we hold them for this. And then, we might do the opposite. So you put your chest forward or back of center, and it creates all of these different, in a sense, emotional stances, right, in your body, or your pelvis all the way back, and walk around. And then we gather together and talk about that. How did that feel to take that posture? How did that feel to be seen in that kind of posture? How did that feel to interact, to see others? And what that does is it brings to consciousness, kind of in a way, all of these stereotypes also that we have about people and how we judge them by how they're standing or how they're moving. And then we take that a step further with an activity called What's My Line, where they actually write down stereotypes. And then they take that posture. There's kind of two teams. One team takes the posture of that stereotype, and the other group then tries to guess who they're being. And we get to talk about how culture impacts our body and our perceptions too. So it's very rich when you really...
And there's stereotypes, and there's also cultural realities, right? Like there are... there is a way in which you can spot which country people are from their pose. Like these aren't just stereotypes, they're actually based in reality.
Well, yes. And so some of the things we talk about that, and let me know after I say this if this is what you're getting at or maybe not, but let's say we take someone like a soldier, right? They're going to have a certain posture. Well, that's a stereotype because it's based in a reality. This is how men and women in the army are taught to stand because it projects a culturally defined sense of kind of power and resistance or whatever that's meant to show, right? And that gets developed through muscular memory and through training. The same way a ballet dancer is going to look a certain way because they've had a certain muscular training over time. And then what we talk about is, that's not necessarily going to go away just because you get out of the army.
Yeah.
That's ingrained in your body-mind cellular awareness, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you can see the military guys, even if they stopped serving a long time ago. And, all nationalities, you can see the Americans by how they held themselves. And at the airport kind of thing, it's pretty obvious. And then the subgroups, right? There's ethnicities and class, how people take space. There's a whole really interesting piece of somatics about how power is embodied. I find that very interesting.
Right. Yeah, I've looked at some of that research as well. But the main point here is really helping these teens, I feel, develop a more conscious awareness of this cultural conditioning that's impacting them in their own bodies and how they're perceiving other people and themselves, related to bullying and all sorts of things, right? To then have more choice and really have more awareness about how they're living and how they're judging others.
Mm-hmm.
It's powerful.
What I love about this embodied work for, could be kids, could be anyone, is you actually get to step into a different way of being. You don't just look at it or study it or read about it. You step into it.
Yes. And there's always a lot of laughing when we do this because, laughing often can be your nervous response to some feelings, right? So you can tell there's a lot bubbling up when we start to engage in that.
I did gender with a group of teens once. It was teen boys. And I was like, okay, what would it be like to be a woman? And I tried to take it away from the comedy aspect, and it was just too much for them, I think they got some insight from it, but it ended up being very, very comical to them, and which in itself is interesting, right?
Yes, right. And I think the flip side of that, Mark, is that at the same time they're recognizing, difference and what it would feel like to embody these differences. There's other activities we do where they really get at a deep level our human commonality, which is also really important. I'm thinking of that activity where we focus on the bones and then they do a drawing of their skeleton. And I don't have that journal entry in front of me, but one of the girls or boys, I forget who did this writing, was saying, as I did that drawing, I recognized that all of us have this common skeleton and that I have something in common with every other human being is fascinating to me. So I think that deep recognition of our oneness right now is also quite important. At the same time, we don't want to gloss over our diversity, but I think in this curriculum, what I've tried to balance is really bringing in awareness of both of those sides of things.
Nice. So how embodiment connects us to our difference, our individuality, our group identities, but also to the shared humanity.
Yeah, and I think the other important aspect of that is, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but eco-somatics. Mm-hmm. Is there some activities in the curriculum, particularly with breathing, where we really emphasize and set up a container for us to remember, in a way, our deep interconnection with the planet and with the trees that are giving us oxygen and taking our carbon dioxide. And, I really think if we had grown up with that as a basis in our education, you wouldn't have leaders who can then dump their toxic waste in the water because they would get it that water in the stream is the same as this interstitial fluid in their bodies. We're so disconnected from that relationship that a lot of harm has been able to be done. So I feel like this is very core right now to bring in this aspect into education.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I guess for resilience too, as well, right? This might sound like a sort of nice middle class kind of luxury to have, but I can imagine this could also be very good for the teens just general robustness in life.
Yeah, and I think part of that, why that's important, is, there's a lot of emphasis on neuroscience now. And neuroscience teaches us that we can only control what we can perceive. And part of the issue with growing up, and with adults too, is we're just not tuned into our bodies. So we don't even have a level of perception that allows us to then monitor what's happening inside. So, we might exercise to the point of injury, or, everyone's experienced getting low blood sugar and then you get annoyed with people. Or you might, a lot of kids get anxious in school, and it might just be they've been sitting for too long and they need to move.
Mm-hmm.
So if we could have more inner perception, we could have more resources on a daily basis to stay balanced, rather than kind of getting so far out of whack that then when a harder life experience comes along, we're already under-resourced.
And how does this kind of resilience idea conflict with the kind of sensitivity culture? The idea of children being very precious and needing safe spaces and having lots of rights and very few responsibilities. I mean, I'd probably say actually the most obnoxious teenagers I've ever met was in Northern California. And they lacked a robustness. There was a sort of extreme sensitivity to them that seemed to have come from the culture there. So is there any counterbalance to that through somatics?
I would think so, because, I'm not familiar with what you're talking about, except I know in sort of the philosophy of things, what you're talking about, there's a move in education toward that idea. I think I'm
talking direct experience. I was pretty shocked actually when I tried to teach an Aikido class in high school in Northern California as a guest one day. It was like no other group I'd ever worked with, and I think the trend has caught on globally since then. This was about 15 years ago, but there was a lack of attention, this kind of attention deficit type thing, a sort of disrespect, and a sensitivity. And I was really surprised by it, like genuinely surprised at the time.
No, I'm curious about that. I think I don't know I have much to say about that. I think the thing I would say is that I feel like this, with these pedagogy points I was talking about, there's a way that it really works to set up a space of shared respect, but that also includes a certain, diligence, and we're actually doing curriculum. We're not just hanging out together, right? So I think you're right that sometimes there can be a more lax attitude that makes them feel like they don't have to show up and really participate. So I think it's also important that you find a way, that we're actually creating a container that's strong enough that there's a buy-in and a participation, not just a, entertainment scene, right? I think that might be a little bit of what's happened in the education I'm talking about.
Yeah, quite a few guests have come on have sort of shared concerns about teens globally around technology use or pornography use or relationships, social media. And I think some of that might just be, old people saying, oh, kids today. But there also does seem to be something there which is different from past generations in terms of behavior, physiology, posture. Anything in that territory interesting to you?
Yes, no, it's a really big issue. It's almost like the technology's become another limb, It's part of their inner world. It's not just part of their outer world, but it is the outer world. One specific thing, I can say, there's one activity in the curriculum we do actually with technology to see how we're relating. This is just more a physiology. It's not the issues you brought up, but it's more the physical manifestation of what it's doing to our bodies, where they explore how they're using their, let's say, cell phone, they're texting on. And I'll have them use their phone, start texting, and then kind of freeze in whatever position they're in.
Right.
And I tell them I'm going to do this, and then they can just feel what's happening in their body.
Right.
And then they close their eyes and realign their 3 body weights. And then I give them back their phone, and then they open their eyes, and they have to keep their 3 body weights, but move. What would you have to do to see your phone? And then, of course, you have to move your hand up, right, or your arm up. But then this is the really important part of the activity. Then I have them just explore moving the phone up and down on their own, and like, where's the best position? How does this feel to have it way up or way down? And then they'll notice, oh, when I'm like bent over my phone like this, my lungs and heart are all compressed in my thoracic cavity here too, and my neck hurts. Right? So then they get to choose, well, what's the best position? So it's that kind of thing that brings some awareness to their physical body.
And such a more compelling and intelligent way to teach than just sit up straight, what teens get told a lot, right? Like just telling them off, oh, you've got bad posture. It's actually sort of getting them to experience that and actually realize for themselves. And I think this would be a great exercise for adults. I'd love to see technology brought more into somatics, actually. I feel like there's a kind of snobbery against technology. And if we don't get skillful at using it in a somatics class, well, when is it going to happen? So I kind of feel like, as well as rolling around on the floor, maybe we should get our laptops out a little bit more in somatics classes. And, it'd be nice to see a Feldenkrais class where everyone had their mobile phones out and things. I think there's as well as an escape from that, it's nice to get away from technology at times. There's also something to be said for sort of skill building use,
Yeah, that's why I included some activity like that. I think in general, though, what we're really lacking is, at least for teens, in my experience in education, is a time to really come together and bond in a healthy way and really realize these kind of things we're talking about, our common humanity, and having some experiences. Some of the curriculum involves touch as well. So I talked about the pedagogy principles, but I also have the 4 basic ways of teaching intentional touch. And
very difficult in schools in the UK. I don't know what it's like there, but there's sort of paranoia around anything to do with touch with children. It's extreme.
Sure. Yes, and for some good reasons too. So it has to be done very respectfully and carefully, and with trained educators, leading these things. But imagine what it would be like if you had just finished your experiential anatomy class with everyone, and let's say that one simple thing of touching down the spine in a gentle way to feel the curves, and then you're in the lunchroom. Well, are you necessarily going to make fun of that kid if you've just done this intimate partner thing with them, right? It builds, and maybe you will, but it builds a different kind of respect and community when you work in a deep kind of somatic way together.
And what a great way for kids to learn boundaries around touch as well. The sort of Me Too movement like that, which has been great, but it doesn't say much for sort of saying how you learn that stuff. And, so I think somatics environments are a great place to learn how to say no and how to ask for what you want, and these kind of basic social skills, which can be, quite dangerous if they're gotten wrong in a sexual context. So, I think, no one wants to talk about teens learning sexuality, I don't think, but it's like, if they don't learn it in a healthy way, they're going to learn it off the internet, and that's maybe not as good.
That's exactly right. And even these kind of things, even though it's not sex education specifically, learning about the consent of, are you ready to start the exercise? Yes. And, just some simple things in place then can translate to them in these other kinds of relationships. So yes, if you don't have some, I think it's Dean Juhan had said, if you don't have some experience with healthy touch, then you're going to go for something else. So
healthy, respecting others' boundaries or whatever. I want to point people to your website, which is SuzanneBreuer.com, BAUER.com. And I'll also link to your book on our page. Is there...
Say the name of my book once? I don't think we've said that. Can I give you the title?
Sure, yeah. Say the title.
It's called The Embodied Teen, a somatic curriculum for teaching body-mind awareness, kinesthetic intelligence, and social-emotional skills. And it's got 50 activities in somatic movement education for adolescents. And it's published by North Atlantic Books.
Great. So mainstream publisher out there in the world. Well done for getting that out. It's for a long time I'd see the same sort of books out about embodiment, and then it was like, oh, okay, your name was put to me. I was like, okay, this is a specialist in this area. It's just really nice to see, and I know that's a great resource to a lot of people. So thank you for writing that.
Yeah, thank you. I think if we really want a next generation that's going to be more empowered and more embodied, we have to start at this younger level and give some support to these practices.
Okay. Closing message or final message about the body for anyone out there?
Well, I think it's important to slow down and get some intimate experience in this kind of way with some somatic practices for yourself. I love this quote by Dean Juhan: "The problems of the individual and society are no more separable than those of the body and mind." So as we each come into more embodied presence for ourselves, that's really what we can share and offer into the world. So I think that's what I would say.
Susan, I like that. Nice place to end. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Mark. Take care.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodiedfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodiedfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you. Until next time, welcome home to the body.